The Arizona territory stretched endlessly under the scorching sun of 1892, its red earth cracked and unforgiving. In the small settlement of Harmony Ridge, 20 miles south of Phoenix, the Woolley compound stood like a fortress against the desert winds. High adobe walls surrounded the main house and several smaller buildings, creating an isolated world where Edwin Woolley's word was law and God's will was whatever Edwin declared it to be. Sarah Mitchell had arrived at the compound 3 days ago, her wagon wheels still caked with the dust of her journey from Salt Lake City. At 19, she was considered an old maid by most standards, but her father had arranged this marriage to Thomas Woolley, Edwin's eldest son, as payment for debts owed to the family's extensive business dealings. The Woolleys controlled much of the territory's grain trade, and their influence reached far beyond their desert stronghold. "Sister Sarah," Edwin Woolley's voice carried across the courtyard as she hung laundry in the early morning heat. At 52, he was an imposing figure with steel-grey hair and eyes that seemed to pierce through flesh and bone. His black coat, despite the desert heat, never seemed to wrinkle or show sweat. "Come, we must discuss your preparation for the sacred union." Sarah's hands trembled as she set down the wet sheet. In the 3 days since her arrival, she had noticed things that made her stomach turn. The way the younger girls, some no older than 12, moved with their eyes downcast, never speaking unless spoken to, the way they flinched when any of the men approached. The strange sounds that came from the main house late at night, sounds that were quickly silenced. Edwin's study was a shrine to his own interpretation of divine will. Religious texts lined the walls, but Sarah noticed they were not the standard Mormon scriptures she knew from her childhood. These were handwritten journals, bound in leather, with titles like The Sacred Mysteries of Celestial Marriage and Divine Revelations of the Flesh. The room smelled of sage and something else, something metallic that made her throat constrict. "Sit, child," Edwin commanded, gesturing to a chair positioned directly across from his massive oak desk. "Your father has entrusted you to our care, and it is my sacred duty to ensure you understand the divine principles that govern this household." Sarah perched on the edge of the chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Through the window, she could see Thomas working in the fields with his younger brothers. At 25, Thomas was handsome in a rough way, but there was something in his eyes that reminded her of a predator watching prey. "Tell me, Sister Sarah," Edwin continued, opening one of his leather-bound journals, "what do you know of the sacred mysteries between man and woman?" Heat flooded Sarah's cheeks. My mother explained the duties of a wife, Brother Edwin." Edwin's laugh was cold, devoid of any warmth. "Duties. Yes, the outside world speaks of duties, but here, in this sacred place, we practice the true revelations given to me by the Almighty. The flesh is not merely for procreation, child. It is a vessel for divine communion." He stood and moved around the desk, his presence looming over her. Sarah's instinct screamed at her to run, but where could she go? The nearest town was a day's ride through hostile desert, and she had no money, no horse, no means of survival. "The preparation begins tonight," Edwin said, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder. His fingers were cold despite the desert heat. "You will join the other women in the purification chamber. Sister Rebecca will explain the sacred rituals that will ready your body and soul for divine service." That evening, as the sun painted the desert sky blood red, Sarah found herself in the basement of the main house. The purification chamber was a windowless room lit by oil lamps, their flames casting dancing shadows on the adobe walls. Strange symbols were carved into the walls, not any religious iconography she recognized, but twisted, disturbing shapes that seemed to writhe in the flickering light. Rebecca Woolley, Edwin's third wife, stood waiting with 3 other women. At 30, Rebecca had the hollow-eyed look of someone who had seen too much and said too little. Her once beautiful face was gaunt, her blonde hair prematurely streaked with gray. "Remove your clothing," Rebecca said in a voice devoid of emotion. "The purification requires complete surrender of worldly modesty." Sarah's hand shook as she began to undress. The other women, she recognized them as wives of Edwin's sons, stood watching with the same hollow expressions. When Sarah hesitated at her undergarments, Rebecca stepped forward. "Obedience is the first law of heaven," Rebecca whispered, her breath hot against Sarah's ear. "Resistance brings only pain. I learned that lesson many years ago." As Sarah's last garment fell to the floor, she noticed the scars, thin, precise lines across Rebecca's arms and back, barely visible in the lamplight, but unmistakably deliberate. Rebecca saw her looking and smiled sadly. "The sacred markings," she explained. "Each one represents a moment of divine revelation. You will receive yours in time." The ritual that followed was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. The women chanted in a language she didn't recognize, while Rebecca painted strange symbols on her body with what appeared to be a mixture of clay and something darker. The substance was warm and sticky, and it smelled of copper and sage. "Tonight, you sleep here," Rebecca said when the ritual was complete. "Tomorrow, Brother Edwin will begin your true education in the sacred mysteries. Remember, child, what happens in this house is God's will. To speak of it to outsiders is to invite damnation upon your soul." As Sarah lay on the thin mattress in the corner of the chamber, she could hear footsteps above her, heavy boots moving back and forth across the floor, and occasionally the sound of a door opening and closing. Once, she thought she heard crying, a young voice quickly muffled. She closed her eyes and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. In the darkness of the purification chamber, surrounded by the smell of sage and copper, Sarah began to understand that she had not come to Harmony Ridge to be married. She had come to be consumed. The morning sun had barely crested the desert horizon when Sarah was awakened by the sound of the chamber door opening. Edwin Woolley stood silhouetted in the doorway, his black coat replaced by a simple white robe that made him look more like a specter than a man of God. "Come, Sister Sarah," he said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. "Your education begins now." Sarah wrapped the thin blanket around herself, but Edwin shook his head. "Modesty is a worldly concern. In the presence of divine revelation, the body must be free of earthly constraints." With trembling hands, Sarah let the blanket fall. Edwin's eyes moved over her body with the cold assessment of a livestock buyer, and she felt something die inside her chest, some small flame of hope that perhaps she had misunderstood the nature of this place. He led her through corridors she hadn't seen before, deeper into the main house. The walls here were covered with more of the strange symbols, and the air grew thick with the smell of incense and something else, something organic and disturbing that made her stomach churn. "The sacred chamber," Edwin announced, as they stopped before a heavy wooden door. "Here, the divine mysteries are revealed to those chosen by God." The room beyond was larger than the purification chamber, with a raised platform in the center surrounded by carved wooden chairs. The platform was covered with what appeared to be animal skins, and iron rings were embedded in the floor around its perimeter. Oil lamps provided the only light, their flames casting grotesque shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. "Sit," Edwin commanded, pointing to the platform. As Sarah reluctantly complied, she heard footsteps in the corridor. Thomas entered first, followed by his younger brothers, Matthew, 19, and Luke, barely 17. All three wore the same white robes as their father, and all three looked at Sarah with the same predatory hunger. "Behold," Edwin said, his voice taking on the cadence of a sermon, "the vessel prepared for divine instruction. Today, my sons, you will witness the sacred mysteries that have been revealed to me through prayer and fasting." Thomas stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "Father, is she ready to receive the full revelation?" Edwin smiled, and Sarah felt ice form in her veins. "She will be, my son, but first, She must understand the true nature of celestial marriage. The outside world teaches that the union between man and woman is for procreation alone, but God has revealed to me that the flesh is a conduit for divine power, that through sacred acts we can commune directly with the Almighty. He moved to a cabinet against the wall and withdrew several items that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. Leather straps, metal implements, and bottles containing liquids of various colors. Each item was placed on a small table beside the platform with ceremonial precision. "The sacred oils," Edwin explained, holding up a bottle of amber liquid, "blessed through revelation to heighten spiritual sensitivity. And these," he gestured to the leather straps, "ensure proper positioning for divine communion." Sarah tried to speak, to protest, but her voice seemed trapped in her throat. The three young men watched with rapt attention as their father continued his explanation, their breathing growing heavier with each word. "Brother Edwin," Sarah finally managed to whisper, This doesn't seem right. The scriptures say..." Edwin's hand struck her cheek with shocking force, the sound echoing through the chamber. "The scriptures are for the uninitiated," he snarled. "What I teach here comes directly from God's mouth to my ear. Would you dare question divine revelation?" Blood trickled from the corner of Sarah's mouth as she shook her head. Around her, the three brothers had begun to remove their robes, and she saw that their bodies bore the same strange scars she had noticed on Rebecca, precise lines carved into flesh, forming patterns that hurt to look at. "The sacred markings," Edwin said, noticing her gaze. "Each one represents a moment of divine ecstasy, a communion with powers beyond mortal understanding. You will receive yours today as you begin your true education in the mysteries of the flesh." What followed was a systematic destruction of everything Sarah had believed about human decency. Edwin's divine revelations were nothing more than elaborate justifications for acts of cruelty and perversion that no loving God could ever sanction. The sacred oils burned her skin, the leather straps cut into her wrists and ankles, and the communion that followed was a nightmare of pain and degradation that seemed to last for hours. Through it all, Edwin maintained his sermon-like cadence, explaining how each act was divinely ordained, how her suffering was purifying her soul for greater revelations to come. His sons participated with the fervor of true believers, their eyes glazed with religious ecstasy as they followed their father's instructions. When it was over, Sarah lay broken on the platform, her body marked with the first of what Edwin promised would be many sacred scars. The amber liquid had left her mind foggy and disconnected from her body, as if she were watching someone else's nightmare from a great distance. "Rest now, Sister Sarah," Edwin said, his voice gentle again, almost fatherly. "Tomorrow we will continue your education. Each day you will learn new mysteries, receive new revelations. In time, you will understand that what happens here is the highest form of worship, a direct communion with divine power that the outside world could never comprehend." As the men filed out of the chamber, Thomas lingered for a moment. He knelt beside the platform and brushed a strand of hair from Sarah's face with surprising tenderness. "It gets easier," he whispered. "The pain becomes different. Father says it's because we're becoming closer to God." "And Sarah?" His grip on her chin tightened. "Never try to leave. The desert has claimed many who thought they could escape God's will." Alone in the sacred chamber, Sarah stared at the ceiling and tried to remember her mother's face, her father's voice, anything from the world beyond these walls. But the amber liquid made memories slippery, and the pain made thinking difficult. All she could focus on was Edwin's promise that this was only the beginning, that each day would bring new revelations, new ways to break her body and spirit in service to his twisted interpretation of divine will. In the distance, she could hear the sound of children playing in the courtyard. their laughter a mockery of innocence in this place where childhood was just another commodity to be consumed by the sacred mysteries of the Woolley family. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's arrival at Harmony Ridge, and the desert heat had become a constant companion to her suffering. Each morning brought new lessons in Edwin's sacred chamber. Each evening found her broken and bleeding in the purification room. The amber liquid had become a necessity. Without it, the pain was unbearable, but with it, her memories of the outside world grew dimmer each day. It was during her 4th week that Sarah first encountered the children's wing of the compound. She had been sent to retrieve fresh linens from the storage room when she heard singing. Young voices raised in what sounded like a hymn, but the words were wrong, twisted versions of familiar melodies that made her skin crawl. Following the sound, she found herself in a corridor lined with small rooms, each containing a narrow bed and little else. The singing came from the largest room at the end of the hall, where a dozen children sat in a circle around a woman Sarah didn't recognize. The woman was perhaps 40, with prematurely white hair and the same hollow eyes that marked all the adult women in the compound. "Sister Martha," the woman was saying to a girl who couldn't have been more than 10, "recite the 3rd sacred mystery." The child stood with practiced precision, her small hands clasped behind her back. "The body is a temple," she began in a voice devoid of childish inflection, "and the temple must be consecrated through sacred touch. The chosen servants of God have the divine right to enter the temple and commune with the spirit within." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp. The other children nodded solemnly, as if this perversion of religious doctrine was as natural as breathing. Some of them bore visible marks, bruises on their arms, scratches on their necks, and in their eyes, the same dead expression she had seen in Rebecca and the other women. "Very good, Sister Martha," the woman said. "Now who can tell me what happens to children who speak of the sacred mysteries to outsiders?" A boy of perhaps 12 raised his hand. "They are taken by the desert spirits, Sister Patience. Their souls are cast into outer darkness, where they burn forever." "Excellent, Brother Samuel. And why must we never resist when called to participate in the sacred mysteries?" A girl with blonde braids, no older than 8, answered without hesitation, "Because resistance is the voice of Satan trying to keep us from divine communion. When we submit to God's chosen servants, we become closer to heaven." Sarah backed away from the doorway, her heart pounding. These children had been systematically indoctrinated, their natural instincts for self-preservation twisted into religious obligation. How long had this been going on? How many generations of children had been raised to believe that abuse was worship? Sister Sarah. She spun around to find Thomas standing behind her, his expression unreadable. In the weeks since her arrival, he had become her primary tormentor under his father's guidance. But away from the sacred chamber, he sometimes showed flashes of something that might have been regret. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly, glancing toward the children's room. "Father doesn't like the new wives to see the young ones until they're fully prepared." "Thomas," Sarah whispered, grabbing his arm. "Those children, what's being done to them?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment she saw something crack in his carefully maintained facade. "They're being prepared for their divine purpose, just as you are, just as I was." The last words were spoken so quietly she almost missed them. "You were..." Thomas looked away, his hands clenching into fists. "I was 7 when Father received his first revelation about the sacred mysteries. I was the first to be blessed with divine communion." His voice was flat, emotionless, but Sarah could see the tremor in his hands. "It's an honor, Sister Sarah. Father says so. The scriptures say so. It must be true." But even as he spoke the words, Sarah could hear the doubt underneath, the voice of a man trying to convince himself that his childhood trauma had been God's will. She realized with growing horror that Thomas wasn't just her captor. He was as much a victim as she was, raised from childhood to believe that abuse was love, that pain was purification. "The young ones learn quickly," Thomas continued. his voice growing stronger as he retreated into familiar doctrine. They understand that their bodies are vessels for divine revelation. When they come of age, they'll take their place in the sacred ceremonies, just as I did, just as my brothers did. And if they refuse, Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. Thomas's expression hardened. No one refuses. Father's revelations are absolute. Those who question divine will, well, the desert is vast, and God's justice is swift. That evening, as Sarah lay in the purification chamber, waiting for the next day's torments, she heard new sounds from above. Younger voices crying out in pain, quickly muffled. The children's lessons, she realized, weren't limited to religious instruction. They were being prepared in the most horrific way possible for their future roles in Edwin's twisted theology. She thought of little Martha reciting her perverted catechism with the solemnity of a true believer, of Samuel explaining the consequences of resistance with the authority of experience, of the blonde girl whose name she didn't know, already trained to submit to whatever horrors awaited her. For the first time since her arrival, Sarah felt something stronger than fear or despair. She felt rage, a burning, purifying anger that cut through the fog of the amber liquid and the weight of her own suffering. These children deserved better. They deserved a chance to know that love didn't have to hurt, that God's will didn't require their bodies to be broken and their spirits crushed. But as the sounds from above continued, the muffled cries, the heavy footsteps, the creaking of floorboards, Sarah realized the true scope of her helplessness. She was one woman against an entire system of abuse, trapped in the middle of a hostile desert with no allies and no means of escape. Even if she could somehow flee, who would believe her story? Edwin Woolley was a respected member of the community, a man of God whose word carried weight in territorial politics. The children's cries eventually faded into silence, but Sarah lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine a way to save them. In the growing light, she could see the carved symbols on the walls more clearly, twisted representations of religious iconography that seemed to mock everything sacred and pure. Tomorrow would bring new horrors, new revelations designed to break her spirit completely. But tonight, listening to the desert wind howl around the compound walls, Sarah made a silent promise to the children sleeping in their narrow beds above her. Somehow, some way, she would find a means to expose the truth about Harmony Ridge. Even if it cost her life, the world would know what Edwin Woolley had done in God's name. The question was whether she would survive long enough to keep that promise. 2 months had passed since Sarah's arrival, and autumn was beginning to touch the Arizona desert with cooler nights and shorter days. Her body bore the accumulated marks of Edwin's sacred mysteries, scars that formed intricate patterns across her skin, each one representing another day of survival in hell. The amber liquid had become her only escape from the constant pain, but it also made her memories unreliable, her thoughts sluggish. It was during one of these drug-induced hazes that she first saw him, a man standing at the compound's main gate, arguing with Edwin in hushed but heated tones. Unlike the other men at Harmony Ridge, this stranger wore the clothes of an outsider, a brown suit, a proper hat, and boots that weren't caked with desert dust. Most importantly, his eyes held something Sarah had almost forgotten existed: compassion. "Brother Woolley," the stranger was saying, as Sarah pretended to tend the vegetable garden nearby, "I've received disturbing reports about the practices at this settlement. As a representative of the territorial government, I have the authority to investigate these claims." Edwin's voice carried its usual authority, but Sarah detected an undercurrent of nervousness. "Brother Morrison, surely you don't give credence to the lies of apostates and troublemakers. This is a place of worship, nothing more." James Morrison, Sarah caught his name as the conversation continued, was a federal marshal investigating reports of unusual activities at religious settlements throughout the territory. Someone, somewhere, had found the courage to speak out about Harmony Ridge, and now the outside world was finally taking notice. "I'll need to speak with your wives and children," Morrison said firmly. "Privately. If there's nothing to hide, you shouldn't object to a simple conversation." "Of course not," Edwin replied, but his smile was cold as winter stone. "Though I should warn you, Brother Morrison, that our women and children have been taught to be wary of outsiders. The devil often comes disguised as authority." That evening, Edwin gathered the entire compound in the main hall, a room Sarah had never seen before, decorated with the same twisted religious symbols that adorned the sacred chamber. Men, women, and children stood in rigid lines, their faces blank masks of obedience. "My beloved family," Edwin began, his voice carrying the hypnotic cadence Sarah had learned to fear, "we are being tested by the Lord. A man claiming to represent earthly authority has come among us, seeking to corrupt our sacred mission with worldly concerns." He paced before them like a general addressing troops before battle. "Remember the teachings of the sacred mysteries. What happens within these walls is divine revelation, not to be shared with those who lack the spiritual preparation to understand. Those who betray the sacred trust will face not only earthly consequences, but eternal damnation." His eyes found Sarah in the crowd, and she felt the familiar chill of his attention. "Some among you may be tempted to speak falsely of our practices, to paint divine communion as something base and worldly. But remember, I am God's chosen vessel. To speak against me is to speak against the Almighty himself." The next morning, Morrison began his interviews. Sarah watched from the kitchen window as he spoke with Rebecca first, then the other wives. Each conversation was brief, and each woman emerged with the same hollow expression they always wore. Whatever Morrison asked, they gave him the answers Edwin had trained them to give. When her turn came, Sarah found herself sitting across from Morrison in Edwin's study, the marshal's kind eyes searching her face for signs of the truth she desperately wanted to tell. But Edwin sat beside her, his presence a constant reminder of the consequences of honesty. "Mrs. Woolley," Morrison began gently, "how would you describe your life here at Harmony Ridge?" Sarah's mouth opened, but Edwin's hand settled on her shoulder. A gesture that would look supportive to an outsider, but felt like a threat to her. It's a blessed life, Marshal Morrison. Brother Edwin has shown me the true path to salvation." Morrison leaned forward slightly. "And you've never been harmed or coerced in any way." The words she wanted to say burned in her throat. "Help me. Save the children. This man is a monster who uses God's name to justify unspeakable acts." But Edwin's fingers tightened on her shoulder, and she remembered Thomas's words about the desert, claiming those who tried to escape. "No, sir," she whispered. "I've been treated with nothing but kindness and Christian charity." Morrison's expression suggested he didn't believe her, but without her cooperation, his hands were tied. He asked a few more questions, each one an opportunity for Sarah to speak the truth. Each one answered with the lies Edwin had taught her to tell. When the interview was over, Morrison stood to leave, but he paused at the door. "Mrs. Woolley," he said quietly, "if you ever need help, if circumstances change, there are people in Phoenix who will listen, people who can protect you." After Morrison left, Edwin's mask of civility dropped completely. Sarah found herself back in the sacred chamber, but this time the lesson was different. This time it was punishment. "You wanted to tell him, didn't you?" Edwin snarled as he secured the leather straps around her wrists. "I could see it in your eyes. The desire to betray everything sacred, to paint divine revelation as something dirty and shameful." The amber liquid he forced down her throat was stronger this time, and the implements he chose were designed for maximum pain rather than his usual twisted pleasure. "Let this be a lesson to all who would question God's chosen vessel," he said. his voice carrying to the other family members who had been summoned to witness her punishment. Through the haze of pain and drugs, Sarah saw the children watching from the doorway. Little Martha, Samuel, the blonde girl whose name she still didn't know. Their faces showed no emotion, no horror at what they were witnessing. They had been trained to see this as normal, as righteous, as God's will in action. But in Samuel's eyes, Sarah thought she saw something different, a flicker of doubt, perhaps, or recognition that what he was witnessing wasn't divine communion, but simple cruelty. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, but it gave her hope that somewhere beneath the indoctrination, the real child still existed. When the punishment was over and Sarah lay broken on the platform, Edwin addressed the assembled family. Let this be a reminder of what happens to those who would betray the sacred trust. The outside world seeks to destroy what we have built here, to corrupt our children with their worldly lies. But we will not be swayed. We will continue to follow the path of divine revelation, no matter what trials the Lord sends to test our faith. As the family dispersed, Sarah caught a glimpse of Morrison through the window, riding away from the compound. He looked back once, his face grim with the knowledge that he was leaving innocence in the hands of monsters. But without evidence, without witnesses willing to speak, there was nothing he could do. That night, as Sarah lay in the purification chamber, she heard footsteps in the corridor. She expected Edwin or one of his sons come to continue her punishment, but instead, a small figure appeared in the doorway. It was Samuel, the 12-year-old boy from the children's lessons. He approached cautiously, glancing over his shoulder to make sure he wasn't followed. "Sister Sarah," he whispered, kneeling beside her mattress, Are you really blessed by God?" The question was asked with the desperate hope of a child seeking truth in a world built on lies. Sarah looked into his young face and saw herself reflected there. The same confusion, the same desperate need to believe that the pain had meaning, that the suffering served some divine purpose. "No, Samuel," she whispered back, her voice barely audible. "What happens here? It's not God's will, it's not blessing, it's just wrong." The boy's eyes filled with tears, the first genuine emotion she had seen from any of the children. I hoped, but it hurts so much, and Father says it's supposed to feel good when you're truly faithful." Sarah reached out with trembling fingers to touch his face. "It's not your fault, Samuel. None of this is your fault. And someday, somehow, it will end." Samuel nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "The man who came today, Marshal Morrison, he seemed kind. Do you think he might come back?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "But if he does, if anyone from the outside world comes here again, you have to be brave. You have to tell them the truth, no matter what Brother Edwin says will happen." The boy looked terrified at the suggestion, but he nodded slowly. "Will you tell them too?" Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. "Yes," she promised. "If I get the chance, I'll tell them everything." Samuel squeezed her hand once, then disappeared back into the darkness of the corridor. Sarah lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Morrison's words. "There are people in Phoenix who will listen, people who can protect you." The question was whether she would live long enough to reach them, and whether she could find a way to take the children with her when she did. Winter had settled over the Arizona territory with unusual harshness, bringing freezing nights and bitter winds that howled through the compound walls. Sarah had been at Harmony Ridge for 6 months now, and the accumulated trauma had taken its toll. Her body was a map of scars, her mind fractured by the constant cycle of abuse and the amber liquid that Edwin used to keep her compliant. But something had changed in recent weeks. The children had begun to look at her differently, not with the blank acceptance they showed the other adults, but with a desperate hope that perhaps she might be different. Samuel had started visiting her in the purification chamber more frequently, bringing other children with him. They would whisper questions in the darkness, Is it supposed to hurt this much? Why does God want us to suffer? Are we really blessed or are we cursed? Each question broke Sarah's heart a little more, but it also strengthened her resolve. These children deserved to know that love didn't have to hurt, that their bodies belonged to them, that God's will didn't require their innocence to be sacrificed on the altar of Edwin's perversions. The breaking point came on a February night when Sarah was awakened by screaming from the children's wing. Not the muffled cries she had grown accustomed to, but genuine terror. The sound of a child in mortal fear. She stumbled from her mattress, her body protesting every movement, and made her way through the dark corridors toward the sound. What she found in the children's common room would haunt her for the rest of her life. Little Martha, sweet, 10-year-old Martha, who recited her perverted catechisms with such solemnity, lay on the floor in a pool of blood. Edwin knelt beside her, his white robe stained crimson, while Thomas and his brothers stood watching with expressions of religious ecstasy. The ultimate sacrifice, Edwin was saying, his voice thick with emotion, the final revelation of divine communion. Through the shedding of innocent blood, we achieve perfect unity with the Almighty. Martha's eyes found Sarah's across the room, and in them, Sarah saw not the blank acceptance of indoctrination, but the terrified confusion of a child who finally understood that the adults she trusted had betrayed her in the most fundamental way possible. "Sister Sarah," Martha whispered, her small hand reaching out. "Help me." The words shattered something inside Sarah's chest, some last barrier between sanity and madness, between submission and rebellion. Without thinking, she lunged forward, pushing Edwin away from the dying child and gathering Martha into her arms. "You monster!" she screamed, her voice echoing through the compound. "She's just a baby. How can you call this God's will?" Edwin's face contorted with rage. "Blasphemer! You dare question divine revelation. You dare interfere with sacred ritual." But Sarah was beyond caring about consequences. She held Martha close, feeling the child's life ebbing away, and something inside her snapped completely. "There is no God here," she shouted. "There's only a sick old man who uses religion to justify his perversions. You're not a prophet. You're a monster." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Around the room, the other children stared in shock, not at Sarah's blasphemy, but at the simple truth she had spoken. For the first time in their lives, someone had named the reality they lived with every day. Edwin struck her with such force that she fell backward, Martha's body slipping from her arms. "Seize her," he commanded his sons. "The devil has taken hold of her tongue. She must be purified through ultimate suffering." As Thomas and his brothers moved to obey, something unexpected happened. Samuel stepped forward, his young face set with determination that seemed impossible in a 12-year-old. "No," he said quietly. The single word stopped everyone in their tracks. Edwin turned to stare at the boy, his face a mask of disbelief. "What did you say, my son?" Samuel's voice grew stronger. "I said no. Sister Sarah is right. This isn't God's will. God wouldn't want Martha to die. God wouldn't want any of us to hurt like this." Other children began to step forward, first one, then another. Then a small group of the older ones who had witnessed too much and endured too much to remain silent any longer. "Samuel speaks the truth," said a girl of perhaps 14 whom Sarah had never heard speak before. "We've been taught to call evil good and good evil, but our hearts know the difference." Edwin's face had gone white with fury. "Apostates! All of you! The devil has poisoned your minds against divine truth." But his words no longer carried the same power. The spell of absolute authority had been broken by Sarah's defiance and the children's courage. For the first time, the victims were refusing to participate in their own destruction. "Thomas," Edwin commanded, turning to his eldest son, "restore order. Use whatever force is necessary." Thomas looked at his father, then at the children, then at Sarah, still kneeling beside Martha's body. For a moment, Sarah saw the 7-year-old boy he had once been, the first victim of Edwin's revelations. The child who had been taught to call abuse love and pain purification. "No, Father," Thomas said quietly, "I won't hurt them anymore." The words seemed to physically stagger Edwin. His own son, his first convert, his most devoted follower, was refusing to obey. "Thomas, you don't understand what you're saying. The sacred mysteries are lies," Thomas finished. "I've known it for years, but I was too afraid to admit it. Too afraid of you, too afraid of the desert, too afraid of facing the truth about what was done to me and what I've done to others." Edwin's empire was crumbling before his eyes. His younger sons, Matthew and Luke, looked uncertain, their faith in their father's divine authority shaken by their brother's defection. The children huddled together, no longer isolated victims, but a united group, finding strength in numbers. "You're all damned," Edwin snarled, backing toward the door. "All of you. When the Lord's judgment comes, you'll burn for eternity for rejecting his chosen vessel." But even as he spoke, Sarah could see the fear in his eyes. Without the absolute obedience of his victims, Edwin Woolley was just a sick old man whose crimes were finally being exposed to the light. "Samuel," Sarah said, her voice hoarse from screaming, "do you remember what I told you about Marshall Morrison, about people in Phoenix who would listen?" The boy nodded, his young face grave with understanding. "Then we're going to Phoenix," Sarah said, struggling to her feet. "All of us, tonight." Edwin laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You'll die in the desert, all of you. The cold will take you before you travel 5 miles. "Maybe," Sarah admitted, "but we'll die free. And if even one of us survives to tell the truth about this place, it will be worth it." As the children began to gather what few possessions they could carry, Sarah knelt beside Martha's body one last time. The little girl's eyes were closed now, her face peaceful in death. Sarah whispered a prayer, not to Edwin's twisted version of God, but to whatever force in the universe might care about the suffering of innocence. "I'm sorry we couldn't save you," she whispered, "but I promise your death won't be meaningless. The world will know what happened here." Outside, the desert wind howled with the promise of a brutal journey ahead. But for the first time in 6 months, Sarah felt something she had almost forgotten existed: hope. They might not survive the night, but they would face whatever came as free human beings, not as victims of Edwin Woolley's perverted theology. The children of Harmony Ridge were finally going home. The desert night was merciless, with temperatures dropping below freezing and winds that cut through their thin clothing like knives. Sarah led the group of 17 children, all who had found the courage to leave, across the rocky terrain, guided only by the stars and a desperate hope that they were heading toward Phoenix rather than deeper into the wilderness. Thomas had chosen to come with them, his knowledge of the surrounding area proving invaluable as they navigated by moonlight. His brothers Matthew and Luke had remained behind with their father, too deeply indoctrinated or too afraid to break free. But Thomas carried the weight of his own crimes heavily, and Sarah could see in his eyes the same desperate need for redemption that drove her forward. "There's a trading post about 15 miles northeast," Thomas said, as they paused to rest behind a cluster of rocks that provided some shelter from the wind. "If we can reach it by dawn, we might find help." The children huddled together for warmth, their faces pale with cold and exhaustion. Samuel had taken charge of the younger ones, his 12-year-old voice steady as he encouraged them to keep moving. The 14-year-old girl, Sarah had learned her name was Ruth, helped carry the smallest children when their strength failed. "Sister Sarah," Ruth said quietly as they prepared to resume walking, "what if no one believes us? What if they think we're just runaway children making up stories?" It was a fear that had haunted Sarah throughout their journey. Edwin Woolley was a respected member of the territorial community, a man whose word carried weight in business and religious circles. Who would believe the testimony of traumatized children and a woman who had been drugged and abused for months? "Then we keep telling our story until someone listens," Sarah replied. Marshall Morrison believed something was wrong. That's why he came to investigate. There are good people in the world, Ruth. We just have to find them. As dawn broke over the desert, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, they crested a small hill and saw the trading post below, a cluster of adobe buildings around a well, with smoke rising from the chimney of the main house. It was the most beautiful sight Sarah had ever seen. The proprietor, a weathered man named Jake Sullivan, took one look at the bedraggled group and immediately brought them inside. His wife, Mary, began preparing food and hot coffee, while Jake listened to their story with growing horror and disbelief. "Edwin Woolley," he said when Sarah finished her account, "but he's one of the most respected men in the territory. He's done business with half the settlements between here and Salt Lake City. That's how he gets away with it," Thomas said quietly. "People see what they expect to see, a godly man leading a religious community. They don't look deeper." Jake studied Thomas's face, perhaps recognizing something in the young man's haunted expression. "You're his son." "I was," Thomas replied, "but not anymore. What he did to us, what he made us do, no father would do that to his children." Mary Sullivan had been examining some of the children, her face growing paler with each scar she discovered. "Jake," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger, "we need to get these children to a doctor. And we need to contact the territorial authorities immediately." Within hours, the trading post had become a hub of activity. A doctor arrived from the nearest town, documenting the children's injuries with clinical precision that would later prove crucial in court. Marshall Morrison, summoned by telegraph, rode hard from Phoenix and arrived by evening, his face grim with the knowledge that his suspicions had been confirmed. "Mrs. Woolley," Morrison said as he took Sarah's formal statement, "I want you to know how brave you've been, what you've done, getting these children out of there. It took incredible courage." Sarah shook her head. "I should have done it sooner. I should have found a way to save Martha." "You saved 17 lives," Morrison replied firmly, "and you've given us the evidence we need to ensure Edwin Woolley never hurts another child." The legal proceedings that followed were swift by territorial standards. Edwin's reputation initially protected him. Many in the community refused to believe the accusations against such a godly man. But the physical evidence was overwhelming, and the children's testimony, corroborated by Thomas's insider knowledge of the compound's operations, painted a picture of systematic abuse that even Edwin's supporters couldn't ignore. The trial became a sensation throughout the territory and beyond. Newspaper reporters came from as far away as San Francisco and Denver to cover the story of the Arizona prophet, whose religious community had been revealed as a den of horrors. Sarah's testimony, delivered with quiet dignity despite the personal cost, became a rallying cry for those seeking to reform the territory's oversight of religious communities. Edwin Woolley was convicted on multiple counts of assault, sexual abuse, and murder in the death of Martha. He was sentenced to hang, though he maintained his innocence to the end, claiming that he was being persecuted for his religious beliefs. His sons, Matthew and Luke, received lesser sentences, the court recognizing that they too had been victims before becoming perpetrators. Thomas chose not to testify against his father, but he provided crucial evidence to the prosecution. After the trial, he disappeared into the vast American West, carrying the burden of his crimes and seeking some form of redemption that Sarah hoped he might eventually find. The children were placed with families throughout the territory, far from the shadow of Harmony Ridge. Samuel was adopted by the Sullivans, who had been moved by his courage and leadership during the escape. Ruth went to live with a family in Phoenix, where she eventually became a teacher, dedicating her life to protecting other children from the kind of abuse she had endured. Sarah herself struggled to rebuild her life. The physical scars healed, but the psychological wounds ran deeper. She suffered from nightmares and periods of deep depression, and the amber liquid had left her with a dependency that took years to overcome. But she found purpose in speaking out about her experiences, traveling throughout the West to warn communities about the dangers of unchecked religious authority. 5 years after the trial, Sarah received a letter from an unexpected source. It was from Thomas, writing from a small town in Oregon where he had found work as a school teacher. He had married a kind woman who knew his history and had helped him find peace with his past. Most importantly, he had dedicated his life to protecting children, using his own experiences to recognize the signs of abuse that others might miss. "I can never undo what I did," he wrote, "but perhaps I can prevent it from happening to others. Every child I help, every family I protect, it's a small step toward redemption. I think of Martha often and of you, and of the courage you showed that night. You saved us all, Sarah. You gave us the chance to become something better than what we were made to be." The Harmony Ridge compound was abandoned after Edwin's arrest, left to the desert winds and the slow erosion of time. But the story of what happened there lived on, a reminder that evil can flourish in the most unexpected places when good people choose to look away. Sarah never returned to Arizona, but she often thought about the desert and the children who had found the courage to walk away from hell. In her darkest moments, she remembered Samuel's young voice saying no to absolute authority, and Ruth's determination to protect the younger children, and Martha's final words asking for help. They had been broken, all of them, but they had also been brave. And in the end, perhaps that was enough, to stand up to evil when it wore the mask of righteousness, to speak truth when lies were easier, and to choose freedom even when it meant walking into an uncertain desert night. The most horrific practices of the Woolley family had finally been exposed to the light, and while justice could never fully heal the wounds they had inflicted, it could ensure that their victims' suffering had not been in vain. The children of Harmony Ridge had found their voices, and the world had finally